There are questions that history refuses to answer. Mysteries buried so deep in the past that the closer we look, the less we seem to see. But there is one question about one man that has haunted scholars, detectives of literature, and ordinary readers for more than 4 centuries. A question so audacious that simply asking it out loud feels like a kind of transgression. Who wrote the works of William Shakespeare? 39 plays, 154 sonnets, 2 long narrative poems, a body of work so vast, so brilliant, so deeply human that it has never been surpassed in the English language. Words that have shaped how we think about love, betrayal, ambition, madness, and death. Words that kings and queens have quoted, that soldiers have carried into battle, that prisoners have read in their cells. And yet, the man whose name appears on all of it left behind almost no trace of his private life. No letters, no manuscripts in his own hand, no diaries, no accounts of his friendships with the scholars and artists of his age. He vanished from the historical record for 7 full years. And when he died, no one, not a single poet, playwright, or nobleman of Elizabethan England wrote a single word of mourning. Is that the life of the greatest writer who ever lived? Or is it something else entirely?
The story begins, as it always does, in a small market town in the English Midlands, Stratford-upon-Avon in the county of Warwickshire. In the 16th century, it was a modest place, a population of perhaps 2,000 souls, set along the gentle curves of the River Avon. Its streets were narrow and partly paved, lined with timber-framed houses of 2 and 3 stories, their upper floors jutting out over the road below. On market days, the smell of livestock and tanned leather filled the air. Sheep from the Cotswold Hills were driven through the center of town. Craftsmen, glovers, cobblers, brewers, malters worked in the ground floors of their homes while their families lived above. It was here, in 1551, that a man named John Shakespeare had moved from the nearby village of Snitterfield and established himself as a successful glover and businessman, eventually rising to serve on the town council. He married Mary Arden, the daughter of a local landowner. Together they would have 8 children. The 4th of those children, baptized on the 26th of April in the year 1564, was named William. William Shakespeare grew up in a house on Henley Street, a few minutes' walk from the center of town. His father, John, was at the height of his success when William was a child. He held civic positions, he traded in wool and grain alongside his glove-making, and he was respected enough to be considered for the office of bailiff, the equivalent in Elizabethan England of a town mayor. But the family's fortunes began to decline in William's teenage years. John Shakespeare fell into debt. He stopped attending meetings of the town council. Whether this was due to financial troubles, religious complications, or private disgrace, the records do not say clearly. What they do say is that by the time William was a young man, the comfortable household of his childhood had become something considerably more precarious. At the age of 18, William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway. She was 26 years old, 8 years his senior, and already pregnant at the time of their wedding. The Worcester Chancellor allowed the marriage banns to be read only once, rather than the customary 3 times, suggesting the ceremony was arranged in some considerable haste. 6 months later, in the spring of 1583, their first child, Susanna, was born. 2 years after that, twins arrived, a boy named Hamlet and a girl named Judith. William Shakespeare was 21 years old, married, and the father of 3 children. And then he disappeared. From 1585 onward, for 7 full years, there is a complete gap in the historical record. No documents, no court appearances, no records of any kind place William Shakespeare anywhere specific during this period. The scholars who have dedicated their careers to this question have named these the lost years, and the more carefully you examine them, the more deeply troubling they become. Some scholars have speculated that Shakespeare left Stratford due to a conflict with the wealthy gentleman Sir Thomas Lucy, and that he may have been involved in deer poaching on Lucy's estate, a story repeated by biographers as early as the 17th century. Others have proposed that he spent those years as a schoolmaster in Lancashire, possibly working for a Catholic landowner named Alexander Houghton. Still others suggest he joined a traveling company of actors, learning his craft on the road before arriving in London. None of these theories can be verified. Not a single one is supported by contemporary documentation. They are, in the honest assessment of historians, educated guesses at best. What makes this silence so remarkable is what came after it. The Comedy of Errors, believed to have been first produced around 1592, draws on works from the Roman playwright Plautus, works for which no English translation existed until 1595. If Shakespeare wrote it before that translation appeared, he must have read the originals in Latin or encountered the plays performed in another language entirely. The knowledge embedded in the plays of Italian cities, of legal procedures, of court etiquette, of military tactics, of classical philosophy is staggering in its breadth and precision. By 1592, Shakespeare appears in the London theatrical world as an established figure. The best available evidence suggests he may have joined one of the troops of players who passed through Stratford in the years 1587 and 1588, making his way gradually to the capital. But the mechanics of that transformation, from provincial glover's son with 3 small children to one of the most prominent figures in the most sophisticated literary scene in the English-speaking world, remain, to this day, unexplained. And in September of 1592, something happened that gave the mystery an entirely new dimension. A pamphlet appeared in London. Its author was a playwright named Robert Greene, dying in poverty, writing in bitterness against the theatrical world that had consumed and discarded him. In this pamphlet, known as Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, he directed a sharp warning at his fellow playwrights, urging them to beware of a certain upstart. He described this person as an actor who had presumed to become a playwright, a man he called, in a phrase that scholars have debated ever since, an upstart crow, beautified with the feathers of others. Was Greene accusing this man of stealing other writers' work? Was he simply expressing contempt for a social inferior who had dared to rise above his station? Or was he saying something more specific, something that, read carefully, suggests the plays being performed under one name had actually been written by someone else? The question, once asked, does not go away easily. What do you think so far? Was William Shakespeare truly the man described in those plays? Or does something in this story feel incomplete to you? Leave your thoughts in the comments. What you are about to discover next may change the way you see one of history's greatest names forever.
By the time William Shakespeare died in Stratford-upon-Avon in April of 1616, he was a man of some property. He owned the second largest house in town, a residence called New Place. He had invested in real estate, in grain storage, and in theatrical shares. He left behind a carefully written will that disposed of his possessions with considerable legal precision. But there is something unusual about that will, something that has troubled scholars for generations. In it, Shakespeare does not mention a single book. He does not reference a manuscript. He does not bequeath any literary works to his heirs. He does not acknowledge the existence of the plays and poems that bear his name. And when he died, despite the fact that the works of William Shakespeare were by then among the most celebrated in the English language, not a single major literary figure in London published an elegy in his memory. Not a poem, not a tribute, not a formal acknowledgement that one of the great minds of the age had passed from the world.
He left no correspondence confirming he was a writer. No patron from the nobility publicly acknowledged knowing him as an author. Neither Queen Elizabeth nor King James, who both loved the theater and who supposedly watched Shakespeare's plays performed at court, ever wrote his name or spoke of him directly in any surviving document. This silence is what gave rise to one of the most persistent controversies in all of literary history, the Shakespeare authorship question. The controversy arises from a perceived lack of historical documentation about Shakespeare's life and education, particularly the so-called lost years. Critics, known as anti-Stratfordians, argue that his remarkable literary output suggests a level of education and worldly experience inconsistent with his humble origins in Stratford-upon-Avon. They propose alternative authorship candidates, such as Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, Sir Francis Bacon, and Christopher Marlowe, or even a collaborative group of writers. The first serious challenge appeared in the middle of the 19th century. A woman named Delia Bacon, no relation to Francis, published a book arguing that the plays had been written by a group of Elizabethan intellectuals led by Sir Francis Bacon, the philosopher and statesman. Her argument attracted ridicule from the academic establishment, but it also attracted readers, and it planted a seed. Francis Bacon was, by any measure, one of the most formidably educated men of his age, a lawyer, a philosopher, a scientist, a courtier, a man whose command of language and ideas was recognized by his contemporaries as extraordinary. Baconian theorists pointed to parallels between his known writings and the language of the plays. They noted that he had studied law at Gray's Inn and that the Shakespeare plays are full of precise legal knowledge. They argued that the sheer volume of literary output attributed to Shakespeare, combined with the absence of any direct evidence of how he acquired his education, pointed toward a more plausible and more learned author. But Bacon had his critics too, and as the 20th century approached, a new candidate emerged, one whose story was considerably more dramatic. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was born in 1550 into one of the oldest noble families in England. He studied law at Gray's Inn, received honorary degrees from both Cambridge and Oxford, and traveled extensively through Italy, visiting the very cities that formed the settings of so many Shakespeare plays. He was a poet, a patron of the arts, and known to his contemporaries as a skilled playwright, though none of his dramatic works survived under his own name. The Oxfordian theory was first proposed in its modern form in 1920 in a book titled Shakespeare Identified by J. Thomas Looney. Looney argued that the known facts of Shakespeare's life did not fit the personality he ascribed to the author of the plays, and that Oxford's life and experiences corresponded more closely to what the plays themselves implied about their author. The parallels are, to say the least, intriguing. Edward de Vere possessed classical learning and deep knowledge of law, music, Italian culture, and the aristocratic sports that feature prominently throughout the Shakespeare canon. His known correspondence and poetry share stylistic qualities with the Shakespeare works, and the plays themselves, Oxfordians argue, are filled with references to his career at court and his subsequent fall from royal favor. In 1580, de Vere fell dramatically from the Queen's grace. He was briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London after his mistress, one of Elizabeth's maids of honor, gave birth to his illegitimate son within the palace itself. The affair triggered violent street brawls and public scandal. He was reconciled to the Queen in 1583, but all opportunities for advancement had been permanently lost. Oxfordians see in this humiliation the emotional core of plays like Hamlet and Othello, works obsessed with betrayal, with the corruptions of court life, with men of exceptional ability destroyed by pride and circumstance. They argued that Hamlet's famous confrontation with the character of Polonius, a pompous, controlling, politically calculating old counselor,
is a direct satirical portrait of William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who was De Vere's father-in-law and the most powerful man at Elizabeth's court. And there is the question of timing. De Vere's known poetry appears to have ceased just before the works attributed to Shakespeare began to appear publicly. The coincidence has struck many readers as more than coincidental. But the Oxfordian theory has one problem that its proponents have never fully resolved. Edward de Vere died in 1604, and at least 12 of the most confidently attributed plays to Shakespeare, including Macbeth, King Lear, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, were written after that date. For de Vere to have written them, he would have had to compose them before his death and arrange for them to be released gradually over the next decade. It is possible, but it requires a degree of elaborate posthumous coordination that stretches credibility. And then there was Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was baptized in Canterbury in February of 1664, just 2 months after William Shakespeare was baptized in Stratford. He attended Cambridge on a scholarship, received his degree, and by his late 20s became the most celebrated playwright in London. His plays, Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, The Jew of Malta, established the blank verse form that would define English drama for generations. And then, on the 30th of May, 1593, Christopher Marlowe died, or so the official record states. According to the coroner's report, Marlowe was killed by a knife wound above the right eye, inflicted in a brawl at a house in Deptford by a man named Ingram Fraser. Marlowe had spent the day there in the company of 3 men, all of whom had documented connections to the Elizabethan intelligence services. The Marlovian theorists argue that what happened at Deptford was not a murder, it was a disappearance. That Marlowe, who was facing charges of heresy that could have led to torture and execution, was smuggled out of England with the connivance of powerful patrons in the government, that the body presented to the coroner was someone else's, and that Marlowe continued writing from abroad, sending his manuscripts back to London, where they were performed and published under the name of an obliging Stratford actor named William Shakespeare. Supporters of this theory point out the key witness to the Deptford events, a man named Robert Poley, one of the Queen's most experienced intelligence agents, was supposed to be delivering letters to the Queen, who was only 16 miles away, but inexplicably took a full week to complete the task. The escape theory, they say, is the only explanation that accounts for this delay. It is a remarkable story, dramatic, conspiratorial, almost novelistic in its construction. But the mainstream of scholarship remains deeply skeptical. The most direct objection is simply that Marlowe was stabbed to death in 1593, as documented in a coroner's report, and that he was therefore dead when the majority of Shakespeare's plays were written. For 4 centuries, these competing claims have generated more books, more arguments, more passionate correspondence, and more fierce academic controversy than perhaps any other question in literary history. Sigmund Freud believed the plays were written by de Vere. Mark Twain expressed serious doubts about the Stratford man. Henry James called it one of the great unresolved mysteries of human culture. But the story does not end with the skeptics, because on the other side of this argument stands a body of evidence that is, in its own way, equally compelling.
In 1623, 7 years after the death of William Shakespeare, 2 men walked into the offices of a London printer named Isaac Jaggard. Their names were John Heminges and Henry Condell. They were actors, veterans of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the theatrical company that Shakespeare had helped to found, and they came with a manuscript. What they brought to that printer would become one of the most important books in the history of the English language, the First Folio. The collection identified the contents as the comedies, histories, and tragedies of Mr. William Shakespeare, and contained 36 plays, 18 of which had never before been published and might otherwise have been lost to history entirely. Prefacing the collection were the words of Ben Jonson, the most celebrated poet and playwright of the age, a man who had known Shakespeare personally for more than 2 decades. Jonson wrote an elegy in which he called Shakespeare the sweet swan of Avon, linked him explicitly to Stratford, and declared that his work transcended the limitations of any single historical moment. He was not, Jonson wrote, of an age, but for all time. Actors John Heminges and Henry Condell, who had known and worked with Shakespeare for more than 20 years, published the folio, as they stated, only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive. They described his manuscripts as papers they had received from him directly, unblotted and ready for the press. Stratfordians point out that Shakespeare's name appears in more than 40 official documents and dozens of literary references during his own lifetime. He is named as a cast member in theatrical productions. He is listed as a sharer, a co-owner of the Lord Chamberlain's men. He purchased property in London and in Stratford. He was involved in legal disputes that generated detailed court records. None of this is consistent with a man who was merely a front, a figurehead, an obliging face attached to someone else's genius. The practical requirements of the theatrical business in Elizabethan London were too demanding, the personal relationships too close, the collaborative nature of the work too intimate for such an elaborate deception to be maintained invisibly across 3 decades. And yet, the mystery does not dissolve entirely, even in the face of this evidence. The silence remains, the absence of letters, of books, of any document in which Shakespeare speaks in his own voice about his own work, the will that mentions silver and property, but not a single manuscript, the daughters who could not write their own names. It was not until 1709, nearly a century after his death, that we have the first serious attempt at a biography of the writer. Most of the source material for that biography consisted of anecdotes and gossip without any documented evidence, and Shakespeare's direct line and all those who had known him personally had died well before that time. What does history ultimately tell us? It tells us that a man named William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, that he married young, became a father early, disappeared for 7 years, and then emerged in London as an actor, a playwright, and a businessman with a gift that has never been replicated. It tells us that his contemporaries, including the man who knew him best among all the writers of his age, Ben Jonson, attributed the plays to him without hesitation and praised him with a reverence that has not diminished in 400 years. But it also tells us that the man left behind almost nothing of himself. No voice, no face we can be certain of, no window into the interior life that produced Hamlet's soliloquies, Lear's anguish, Prospero's farewell. Perhaps that is the deepest truth of the Shakespeare mystery, not that he was someone else, but that he was so fully given to his work, so completely dissolved into the characters he created, that he left no room for a private self to survive. The plays endure. The man behind them remains, in some essential way, unknowable. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that has never stopped haunting us, perhaps the man we think we know was always, in some sense, a fiction, a name on a title page, a convenient identity for something that could not, in the world it came from, bear its own true name. 4 centuries have passed. The question has not been settled. It may never be settled. And perhaps that, too, is very much in the spirit of the man, or the mystery, we call Shakespeare.
If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, know that your curiosity, your patience, and your willingness to sit with a question that has no easy answer is something extraordinary.
History belongs to those who refuse to stop asking. And the greatest gift literature has ever given us, whoever wrote it, is the reminder that the questions that cannot be answered are often the ones most worth asking. Thank you for being here. The best is yet to come.